am sharing my screen, so I can't see myself or you or your chat, but we have people on the back end that will be able to help you with any technical difficulties. And when it comes to Q&A time, I'll stop sharing my screen so I can see some of the comments that you've left throughout this presentation. So yeah, just a heads up, but I'll give us a couple of minutes and then we'll kick off. All right, so I think we can go ahead and get started. And also for everyone who are educators, which I think are the majority of you, I have a huge respect for the ability of educators to live with uninterrupted silence to allow for answers. I'm very bad at it. So 2 minutes was my mark for that. So yeah, thank you again for joining and taking time to be with me here today. My name is Emily Larson, and I'm a senior advisor at the Behavioral Insights Team. I'm currently based out of Brooklyn, New York, but previously worked in our London offices for about 2 years. So I've been at BIT for 3 years. And during that time, I've been sort of leading our well-being work and trying to kind of build up our well-being portfolio. And today I'm going to walk you through a trial that we ran. It was a 7-month trial, and it was funded by the McConnell Foundation and their company called Well-Ahead. And I'm going to run you through, during this time, kind of an introduction to the Behavioral Insights team, if you're not familiar with who we are and kind of what we do. And then I'll introduce you to the Well at Work program, which is the trial that we ran in Canada. And then I'll go through some of the results at kind of a high level, and then move into what this means, what the lessons we learned, and some kind of practical applications taking the research forward. And then I'll try to allow for about 20 minutes of question and answer. So to kick it off, a bit about BIT, which is always a fun saying. You may know us as kind of the nudge unit. So we started off kind of life inside of government. So we're a global social purpose company. We were born inside the UK government, and our remit is applying behavioral science to a variety of policy challenges. Since the kind of early days when we started about 10 years ago, we've grown quite substantially, and we now have over 200 behavioral science professionals, and we have offices in London, New York, Washington, Toronto, Sydney, New Zealand, Singapore, Paris, and Manchester, and that kind of continues to grow. And so in total, we have run over, I think, well over now 900 behavioral insights projects. And these include projects on things like well-being, which I'll be talking about today, social cohesion, sustainability, physical and mental health, as well as things that are outside of my area of policy expertise, like recycling, sustainable development, and kind of like tax adherence, things like that. And I think more recently, we have been trying to work more in this space around how can we apply behavioral insights to mental health and well-being. And to date, we've run around 14 plus kind of large trials in this space. And this includes the one I'm going to present. And so I think it's important that we are learning as we do this. It's a very kind of new field, the application of behavioral insights or behavioral science and well-being science. So I think lots of lessons learned from all of this. So behavioral insights is a term that we coined, and it's essentially an approach that uses evidence of conscious and non-conscious drivers of human behavior to address practical issues, which seems very confusing. So in simpler terms, kind of when it comes to our well-being, for example, we might think we know what makes us happy. So I might have the misconception that a new house, more money, a different job, these kinds of things will contribute to my overall well-being. But oftentimes there is actually a disconnect between what we think will make us happy and what evidence-based practices actually work. And equally, even if we are right in knowing what makes us happy, we often struggle to find the time to actually do those things. And so I'm sure this is a foreign concept to you and a challenge for me personally as well. And I think this is really where behavioral insights and behavioral science comes into play. So first, we try to use behavioral insights and behavioral science to understand what are those kind of misconceptions we have around well-being behaviors. So that disconnect between what we think makes us happy and what evidence shows makes us happy. And then also trying to bridge that gap between knowing something and actually doing something, which is a huge difference. So that's a little bit about what behavioral insights are. And we try to use findings from psychology, behavioral economics, and apply rigorous methods and evaluation to test our interventions. So Well at Work is the project that I'm going to be focusing on today. I'm going to walk you through this project that we ran from November to June of this year. So we just wrapped up. And this was funded by, again, the McConnell Foundation and the overarching program we called Well at Work. Just to briefly explain kind of we love an acronym at BIT. So this is called our TESTS methodology. And this is what we use when working on any project. So we start with the target, which is defining what are we trying to achieve. So what is the behavior that we're trying to change, or what is the behavioral goal? And then we do explore work, which is trying to understand, oftentimes through interviews or literature reviews or archival data that we have access to, what are some of the barriers to that goal? So what are the things that prevent us from actually reaching that goal? And then based on the findings from our explore work, we design in the solution phase the interventions that we think might help overcome some of these barriers. Finally, we take these into trial. As I said, wherever possible, we try to run rigorous randomized controlled trials, which is the case for this project of work. And then scale, which is where we try to inform policy and practice with the results that we found. So I'm going to move a bit quickly through the first kind of two phases so that we can get into the meat of the solution. So what was the intervention that we came up with? And then equally, what were some of the results that we found? So our overall target and kind of what we wanted to work on was how can we increase whole school well-being? And this is referring to K through 12 education in Canada. The explore activities that we engaged in to gain a better understanding of the landscape in Canada specifically were interviews with leading academics to better understand some of the best practices and the literature around well-being in schools. We also conducted a site visit, which happened in Vancouver, and we conducted 25 interviews with principals and administrators, 10 interviews with teaching and non-teaching staff, 10 with principals, 13 with teaching and non-teaching staff. And then we also spoke to 2 school districts. And then we also conducted a pretty extensive review of the literature that already exists on well-being, burnout, and school culture change. So from these, we kind of split our findings very roughly between stressors and enablers. So what were the top kind of stressors that we found that would prevent people's well-being or mental health at school? And the first one, I don't think any of these will be groundbreaking or surprising to those of you working in education. The first thing we found was the workload. So one quote saying, I get hundreds of emails every day. There's so much information coming in at me. And this was in addition to obviously having to do lesson planning and managing parents, dealing with internal kind of politics. So just generally having a very high workload contributing to a lack of mental health and burnout ultimately. The second task was behavior management. So behavioral challenges, for example, led one teacher to ask, can I really still do this when I'm 65? So we found that behavior management in the classroom was like a real strain on the ability for educators to focus in the classroom and to kind of devote all of their energy. And this led to people feeling, kind of deflated at the end of the day. And the last thing, which again, I think it's important to note, this work was conducted pre-COVID. So we did all of this explore work prior to COVID. And so I'm imagining that there'll be some differences now, but not switching off was a huge thing. So, a quote, this is a hard job to not be here for. You're always thinking about the kids. So taking work home with you. And now in living with kind of COVID and coming out of COVID, I think this might be even harder. My office right now is my home, and so it is quite difficult to switch off, which I imagine to be the case for a lot of educators as well. Some of the enablers that actually allowed for people to have kind of to be reinvigorated, have higher sense of well-being and mental health, and protected them from burnout were interactions with the kids. So feeling like you make a difference stops the burnout. Which I, again, think has implications. When we moved to remote teaching, there was kind of decreases in the amount of interactions and the kind of feeling that you're making an impact. The second thing was support from educators. So feeling like you were really connected and you were part of a community that you could lean on. And then the last one was collaboration. So when we asked the one thing that they would change to improve school well-being, many mentioned collaboration with their colleagues, whether that be with lesson planning or with just collaborating more generally on like out-of-school activities and kind of socializing. So those were kind of, again, a very high level summary of some of the overall explore findings. And moving into the solution phase, this project I think is very unique in the sense that we fully acknowledge and we know that there are structural changes that need to happen in order to enable whole school well-being. However, these changes were really outside the scope of our work. So we were looking for small scale, low cost intervention ideas that could be implemented across a variety of schools. So we were working with, K through 12. So we needed to consider the different, the kind of different audiences. And we're also working with all school staff. So that included everything from principals and leadership to teaching and non-teaching staff. So there was kind of a wide range of participants that we needed to consider. And then we also wanted to make sure that the solutions we came up with weren't adding a huge, significant burden, because we obviously know that workload was something that was a huge stressor. So we didn't want our intervention to be something that increased workload. And as mentioned, we wanted this to be applicable to, we worked with around 160 schools across 3 provinces. So these interventions had to be applicable across all of those. And then finally focusing on like, what can we feasibly change? And that's, again, where a lot of the structural changes that would be great to make were very much outside of our scope. So ultimately, we came up with two solutions, one of which were weekly well-being text messages, and the second were principal endorsement emails, which I will walk you through in a bit more detail. So the first solution is a weekly well-being program, and this was sent through text message. We heard a lot that principals and teachers alike were very overwhelmed with emails, and we've used a lot of text message trials to try to mitigate this. So to try to have people pay more attention and for our interventions to be slightly more salient compared to what they might get in an email. And this included prompts that were delivered about once a week over the course of 7 months. So in total, we sent participants 37 text messages. And the themes that we focused on were evidence-based themes. And just to highlight a few, those were things like gratitude. So, gratitude in the sense of highlighting stories. So getting stories from students on the impact their teacher has made, but also encouraging participants to actually practice gratitude. So things like, what are 3 good things that happened to you today, or trying to notice the small things. We also focused a lot on storytelling. So storytelling to sort of normalize people's struggles that they were going through, which we felt was really important, especially in light of COVID. And also to just like normalize the fact that we're all in this together. So things like, you're not alone. I've often had struggles with, parent engagement or something along those lines. Because I think sometimes we can feel very isolated and siloed. And again, especially in light of COVID. And then we also wrote messages around normalizing healthy practices. So these were things that we, again, evidence-based behavior change techniques around things like even physical activity, and other kind of tips around turning off and trying to have work-life balance. And then finally, supporting healthy thinking patterns. So again, these text messages were based on evidence, and they were first tested with kind of a small group of educators and administrators to make sure that we were striking the right tone with these messages. And I'll get to the details of how we recruited participants and got consent in about 2 slides. So this was the first solution. So a series of weekly text messages based on evidence-based practices. And then the second solution was principal endorsement. So one of our groups in the trial received, in addition to the weekly text messages, 4 principal emails or endorsement emails over the course of the year. And these emails were really meant to reinforce and kind of normalize well-being practices that were being reflected in our text messages. We wrote these emails based on 4 themes. So the first one, which I think is incredibly important, was permission for wellness. So for example, it's okay to take time for yourself. This is part of our school culture. And we know that principals and leadership obviously have a huge impact on the culture of the school. So we wanted to make sure that the first message that was sent out was something that was allowing people permission to actually engage with the intervention materials we were sending them. The second theme was fresh start. So this is based on some research from Katie Milkman, which finds that people are much more likely to change their behaviors during transition points. So for example, around a new semester. So having principals send out emails to remind them at timely moments about well-being and mental health. And then again, we had to adapt during this trial because COVID happened. And so one of the messages was around COVID-19 and mental health. And so really acknowledging that there's a significant disruption happening. That's okay to feel kind of to feel anything and to deal with this in a different way, and also linking people to additional support if they needed it. And then the final message was gratitude. So this was sent at the end of the year from principals to education staff participating in the trial to really emphasize, gratitude to educators throughout the year, especially this year. And BIT wrote the templates for these emails, but we prompted principals to make the emails their own by personalizing them. So for example, we encouraged principals to add examples from their own life of times that either they've struggled with mental health if they felt comfortable, or examples of things that have helped them in the past, like wellness techniques that they use, just to make it a bit more relatable. And also making them feel aligned with kind of their own school values. So I think we'll get to this point later on, but it is really important that these emails are based on evidence, but also are adapted to the school culture. So as promised, a bit more about the trial design. So we invited around 2,178 kind of school staff to respond to our invitation to take this well-being survey and to participate in the trial. From those individuals, 1,202 actually did take the baseline survey and consented to participate in this study. So this is across 3 Canadian provinces. We worked in BC, Manitoba, and Alberta. And this trial included 109 different schools across those 3 provinces. And just to give you a sense of kind of the flow, so once schools in general had agreed to participate, we provided them with an email to explain to the staff what this initiative was, what it was all about. And then all school staff were given the opportunity or the option to participate by taking this baseline survey and also providing their cell phone number, because we were going to be sending text messages to them. So we needed their phone number. Important to note that even if they provided their phone number at any point, they were able to opt out, and they were given clear instructions on how to do so. And then once we had consent, we randomly assigned participants at the school level into either the control group, treatment 1, which was just receiving the weekly well-being messages, or treatment group number 2, which was the combination of weekly well-being messages plus principal endorsement letters. And as you can see, we ended up taking measurement at 3 points. So baseline survey in January, midline survey happened in February of 2020, and then endline survey happened June 2020. And again, you can see that we did experience attrition, some significant attrition from baseline to endline survey, but we did still have enough power to kind of try and detect significant effects. And just another note, only around 4% of the treatment participants, so those assigned to group 1 or 2, opted out or unsubscribed of receiving the text messages, which is a good indication of how they were received. And the outcome measures that we used, so we had 2 primary outcome measures. The first one was well-being. So we used the short Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Health Wellbeing Scale, which is a very snappy title. And this is a 7-item questionnaire asking questions around lately, how often have you been feeling optimistic, useful, and been thinking clearly, as an example. And the lowest you could score would be a 5. The highest you could score is a 35 on this scale. And the second measure was burnout, using the Copenhagen Burnout Inventory. And again, this was 7 items. This was a 0 to 100. And so if you scored 0, you had absolutely no indications of burnout. If you scored 100, you had extreme burnout. And now getting into the results. So this is the the primary outcomes, and what looks like a very at first glance slightly uninteresting graph perhaps, but I think there's a lot of kind of nuance behind this that I'll get into. So after collecting end-to-end survey data, we conducted analysis, and you'll see that the control group, so they received no intervention, is kind of the gray line, which is, it's a bit difficult to see because they overlap. The treatment, number 1, is the blue line, which again, they received only the weekly SMS messages. And then treatment 2 is the orange line, and they received both the weekly SMS intervention messages and also the 4 principal endorsement letters. And you can see on the scale, again, this is from 0 to 35, with on well-being, 35 being kind of the highest well-being you could have, 0 being the lowest. And then burnout is on a scale of 0 to 100, with 0 being absolutely no burnout, 100 being very much burnt out. So if we kind of look at this, you can see that there's the kind of well-being and burnout is relatively flat over time. Looking at well-being specifically, you can see that there's a general downward trend across all groups. So on average, across all of the conditioned groups, participants' well-being score decreased by about 1 point from baseline to midline, and decreased by about 1.3 points from baseline to endline. And again, this is on a scale of 0 to 35, so that's not a significant decrease. And I think this is really interesting for a lot of reasons. Particularly because this intervention happened pre-COVID. So this would be at baseline, COVID did not exist. And then midline reflects a little bit of COVID, but I don't think it had fully, kind of kicked off, especially in Canada at this point. And then at endline, we were very well acquainted with COVID. And so I think it's interesting to see here that we aren't experiencing across all groups very much change, and well-being seems to be quite stable over time, despite the fact that there was a global pandemic. And so I'll discuss this a little bit more when we talk about kind of what impact measurement might have had on this, but interesting to reflect on. And then similarly, burnout score did increase, but only increased by about 3.5 points from baseline to midline, so from here to here, on a scale of 1 to 100, and increased only by 2.2 points from midline to endline. So again, we did see overall kind of small trends that people were experiencing, general decreases in well-being and general increases in burnout, but they were not statistically significant as measured by the scales that we used. So moving on to our secondary outcomes. Again, we asked questions around if people found work meaningful, if they felt valued as a staff member, if they had a sense of belonging with colleagues, and also a number of sick days taken, which can sometimes be a proxy for kind of absenteeism and burnout. And we didn't see any significant effects across treatment groups on this, which again means kind of our intervention didn't seem to have an impact on these outcome measures. I think interestingly, at Endline survey, we asked participants how likely they would be to pay attention to well-being resources compared to pre-COVID. And we found that across all groups, people reported a very high percentage of willingness to pay attention. So, for example, the control group reported that they were 80% likely to pay attention to well-being resources compared to pre-COVID. Treatment 1 reported 81% and treatment 2, 85%. So it seems like people more willing to engage and or pay attention with these well-being resources in light of COVID. And equally, when we asked likelihood to take action on well-being advice compared to pre-COVID, we found kind of the same high percentage across all groups. Similarly, around from 80 to 86% of respondents saying that they would be likely to pay more attention compared to pre-COVID. So again, there was not a significant difference detected, but it does appear that people were more likely to be attentive and were more likely to act on well-being advice in light of COVID. And then finally, we asked people, to what extent has COVID-19 affected your well-being on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being very much. So you're very impacted by COVID. And this is where we did see a very small but significant positive effect on participants in treatment group number 2. So again, treatment group number 2 received the principal endorsement letters alongside the weekly SMS messages. And while this effect was very small, it does lead us to kind of some indications that the combination, there was some sort of kind of benefit of the additive effect of receiving weekly well-being messages plus these principal endorsement letters, which I'll get to in a few slides about what we think kind of recommendations for moving forward might be. And quickly, we also conducted some qualitative feedback after the trial. And in general, we found that the text messages and emails were actually very well received. So the school staff reacted very positively. Again, the people who were willing to respond to our interview request may have had either, we tend to see kind of either very negative or very positive reactions. And it seemed that people enjoyed receiving these messages. A lot of people said that they really looked forward to getting them, and it was sort of the text message, even if they didn't necessarily read it or even act on the specific advice, it served as sort of a prompt just to remind them to reflect on their well-being. The preference for text message content varied a lot. So some people said they really loved the stories and they found that those resonated with them a lot more. And other people enjoyed more of the kind of action-oriented messages. So more specific prompts around things like writing down gratitude at the end of the day. And principals in particular were quite happy with the email templates and said that they had gotten some pretty positive feedback from staff, and staff were really appreciative of getting those emails. And then also, I don't think this will be surprising, but we found in our interviews that school administration obviously plays a large role in maintaining staff wellness. So administrators or principals who routinely include messaging on well-being in their emails and other communications for their staff. So for some school leaders, the email and text message intervention was kind of a natural extension of how they already focused on well-being. Whereas for other schools, it might not have felt as natural and could have come across as maybe less authentic, which could have an impact. So very important that any messaging sent out, we're taking school context into account. And finally, moving on to lessons learned. So what does this all mean? So I think kind of overall takeaway is that our results indicate that these kind of light touch SMS interventions appear to be insufficient to significantly move Copenhagen burnout inventory and the short Warwick-Edinburgh mental well-being scale over a period of about 7 months. And we think that this could be due to a variety of factors, one of those being measurement. So there is a question of, and I'm happy to get into this more in the discussion, but are the measurements that we use sensitive enough to detect change? So well-being and burnout are difficult difficult constructs to move, and our measures might have been capturing state-based well-being and burnout rather than trait-based. So trait-based being much more flexible, essentially. Equally, it could be the case that our measurement wasn't frequent enough to capture and kind of any substantial change, and that increasing the frequency of measurement might be beneficial. Additionally, the intervention content could have also caused this. So while we used evidence-based interventions, it would be worth looking at the themes. So for example, we know gratitude and mindfulness have some of the largest effect sizes outside of controlled experimental environments. And so perhaps looking at other research and meta-analyses and trying to see which of the themes that we used actually have the most evidence outside of these kind of more artificial experimental environments. Also, because of the nature of this intervention, the content did have to be applicable to a very wide range of participants. And so one of the kind of the feedback that we got in the interviews was some of it felt a bit generic and maybe wasn't personalized enough. And then I think finally, a point I'll just touch on is that something I touched on earlier, that kind of there was weak but significant evidence that pairing these messages with additional system level leadership support may be helpful. So moving forward, I think it's really important to place these results in context. Obviously, COVID happened. That was, kind of a big thing. But equally, the area of well-being science is still relatively new, and especially the field of these kind of lighter touch interventions need to be studied more. So while we didn't detect significant effects from our trial, overall, we do feel like there are a few things that we would encourage schools to think about moving forward. The first is the use of SMS as a channel to connect staff to resources and well-being strategies. So in a world kind of where we're constantly bombarded with information, SMS could be a unique channel to direct people to, perhaps existing mental health resources that you have at your school, and also may serve as a good way to reinforce and increase kind of more intensive services like counseling or employee assistance programs. And also consider sending kind of timely reminders to engage in helpful practices that were described in this report. So we do know from other studies that mobile SMS message reminders have been found to enhance kind of healthy behavior. So it's worth still considering them, but potentially with more tailoring. And then finally, as noted a few times, we really do think there is some merit in refining and really prioritizing the leadership messages that we sent out. So making sure that leaders are personalizing these messages so that they are specific to the school culture and include as many kind of examples as possible. And equally, wherever possible, encouraging leadership to kind of role model this behavior. So not enough to just sort of send an email, but also to try to really, walk the walk. And we know leadership behavior has a pretty significant influence on staff well-being. And so those are kind of two overarching things we would recommend moving forward with. And I know I am at my 40-minute mark, so I am going to very quickly just give you kind of a few overarching lessons that you might be able to apply more generally based on EAST. So again, we love a good acronym. EAST is an acronym we use for behavior change. And essentially, if you want to change someone's behavior, try to make it easy, attractive, social, and timely. And we think there's some application for East to be applied to well-being and mental health. So, for example, trying to reduce the amount of friction in uptake of mental health or well-being services. So, for example, how easy is it for your staff to access kind of therapy or mental health services that are being provided? Might you be able to change the default? So, we're heavily influenced by default settings. Are there services that you could default people into while still allowing them to opt out if they wanted? And then I think really importantly, simplifying options. So rather than sending people, a very long list of 20 services that they could partake in, we often think choice is very good, which sometimes is the case, but it can be paralyzing too. So where possible, trying to simplify the options that you're giving people. The second is making it attractive. So making benefits more salient. I think this is especially true when it comes to well-being behaviors. The benefits to practicing meditation or mindfulness are not always immediate. And so we have a tendency to sort of discount them in favor of rewards that come very easily or quickly. So for example, I'm guilty of skipping my morning meditation in favor of a nice coffee instead, which in the short term is good for me, but in the long term, obviously is not. So the more you can kind of frame messages and bring forward those kind of benefits from well-being behaviors, the better. So for example, messages around, spend 5 minutes today on mindfulness to avoid longer mental health challenges. Second one is messenger effect. For this trial, we sent all the messages from a kind of blanket person called Well at Work. And I think, we're very heavily influenced and more receptive to information from people who are more similar to us and people who we can relate to. And so future trials should think a lot about maybe the messenger being a fellow educator or potentially someone that they could relate to. And then finally, personalize. So I think I've touched on this a bit, so I won't go in more detail. And then finally, making it social. So the use of social norms can be a really good benchmark for our own behavior. So when if you're developing messaging around well-being and mental health services, you can reduce the stigma by trying to use social norms. For example, you could say X amount of people your age have met with a therapist this year, or X% of your fellow teachers have made a commitment to improve their well-being. It's important that these statistics are actually true, that using things like this and kind of normalizing mental health practices or well-being practices can be really beneficial. Again, peer-to-peer messaging is something I touched on briefly, but trying to kind of, again, reduce this stigma. If we can utilize peers to sort of normalize these well-being behaviors and kind of set a norm for the rest of the school, could be very beneficial. And then normalizing it. So again, this kind of goes back to school culture, but framing messages in a way that make people feel like this is a community practice. This is something that we're all doing together and not singling out individuals as if they're the only ones who need kind of mental health support. And I promise this is the last slide before questions. Making things timely. So trying to bookend the year. So we know from our research that people are more receptive to information, again, at those transitional moments. So use the beginning and the end of the year as an opportunity to reorient staff with mental health services available to them and to try to get them to engage or sign up for them. Equally, use prompts at timely moments. So when things are going to be more stressful, think about sending supportive messages during the year. So for example, that might be in the lead up to exams or when educators are having to do a lot of marking for exams, sending kind of more well-being prompts around those kind of timely moments. And then finally, checking in. So taking measurements of school well-being often, I think, is really important. As noted from the discussion above, I think it can be very hard to detect changes in school well-being by using these kind of yearly measurements. So in order to understand and respond accordingly to how your school is feeling, I would suggest taking short measurements as often as you feel appropriate to get a better sense of any common trends. And this can also kind of help inform when you provide more support in a year. If you notice that at certain months, maybe when it's kind of cold and dreary in February, people might need more mental health support, you can kind of tailor to their needs by checking in more frequently. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your patience. I'm going to stop sharing my screen in a second, but please do jot down my email address. I'm very happy to follow up and answer questions or provide more information if needed, but I will open it up now and stop sharing my screen. Okay, so first question, some of both the stressors, email volume, workload, and enablers, collaboration, appreciation, gratitude, were common in focus group data collected in 3 BC school districts. One key difference that I'm seeing so far is the limited scope of the interventions. Understandable, but some of the work done in BC is attempting to face some of the bigger systematic issues. So how to combine all of the learning from whichever source. A very detailed and complicated question. I think so yes, there's definitely limited scope of interventions, and I think that we, kind of our overarching recommendation from this research is that these small scale interventions can take us some of the way. But obviously, as you say, we need to have systematic changes in terms of setting kind of different policies, at a school or district level, trying to decrease workload, behavior management, all of these things. But again, this is not the kind of work of us. This is not BIT's kind of scope of work, and we really need to work with policymakers to make that kind of larger systematic change happen. So I don't think that's probably like a amazing answer to your very good question. But the truth is, I don't think we have an amazing answer for that yet. Are the means in well-being and burnout at time one those of all of the participants, or just those who remained in the study at time 3? So the means in well-being at time 1 would be for, so the baseline are the means at baseline. So that would include all the participants, so the 1,202 participants at baseline. And then at end line, it includes only the participants who continued on with the study. I only see a couple of other questions. I think the slides and recording will be made available after the session. Yeah, so they'll be made available. How can we advocate for those changes in school board policy to make larger systematic change happen? I emailed someone in my elementary teacher foundation, not union, to find a way to start a committee to advocate for mental wellness. And he told me that he was told to leave mental wellness to the professionals. What can educators do? Yeah, this is a fantastic question. And I think something that a lot of organizations, not just educational ones, face. I think having leadership buy-in obviously is extremely important, but in the schools that we visited, and I'm not suggesting anyone go rogue, but in the schools that we visited, there were a lot of kind of grassroots efforts that teachers were doing together. So I don't know that has to be something as formal as trying to change the mental health policies, but I think a lot of the research suggests that having these sort of support groups where you share, best practices, tips, struggles, whatever that might be, are also really helpful to mental health. So I, again, don't have amazing advice on how to kind of change the policies or change leaderships at schools, but I do think grassroots mechanisms have been shown to be pretty effective at schools. And just, sorry, a final note on that. I think in my career, I've spent a lot of time speaking to policymakers and speaking to education leaders and trying to convince them that mental health and well-being are important. And so if you, this is a great question. If you want to email me after, I'm happy to share some of that research. I think when you can make the links between not only does mental health and well-being matter, just period, but it also matters for students' performance. It matters for teachers' performance, turnover rates, burnout, all of these kinds of things that affect bottom lines. And also, there have been studies to show that mental health and well-being increases standardized test performance and scores. I found that when working with kind of higher level leadership, it can be useful to present these more kind of concrete links from well-being to some of the outcomes that they're kind of mandated to show as a school leader. Have any of the participating schools continued to use text messages and email interventions? Yeah, I think a few of them have. We provided participating schools with, they have the email templates, and I think they've continued to use some of them. And a few of the other schools have reached out to see if we were willing to share all of our messages with them. So I think they, for the most part, the schools that we've been in contact with were keen to continue in some way with this kind of intervention. And yeah, my email address again, I don't know if there's somewhere I can type that, but it is emily.larson, LARSON, at bi.team. And it will be, if the slides are shared, it will be in the slides as well. If you were to rejig the interventions based on qualitative feedback, what would you do now? Good question. I think looking back on the intervention, I think I would have tried to personalize a bit more. I think that was a big thing that came out, that people felt it's going to be hard when you're working with a kind of a sample size of over 1,000 people to make it feel personal. But I think I would have tried to be a bit more intentional about understanding the challenges in real time. So I think, for example, when COVID happened, we had to really adapt our approach. And I would have loved to, go back and speak to more teachers, understand what they were facing, and try to really work on personalizing those messages. So I think that's one of the things that I would have tried to change. I was intrigued by the story/action option offered in the messaging. Might it be good for people to choose on the day When do you make, yeah, this is a great question. And this is actually something that we are trialing now, is the kind of the different impact of storytelling versus kind of action-based tips. And we're trying to see if there's a kind of a difference between those two. So I have that question myself, and I love the idea. I think one way of personalization that we sort of had is potentially exactly what you're saying, which is to kind of offer people like what kind of tips do they feel like, or maybe a pre-survey where they could specify a little bit more what they're looking for. And again, that might help with one of the points around personalization and making it feel like it was more tailored to them. Very good suggestion and point. Thank you. And I think I have, a question from Sarah. The clarifying whether or not the reinforcing message from the principal was effective. So in treatment group 2, where we did the combination of the principal message and the weekly text message, we saw a small but significant effect on the impact of COVID. So people who received both the principal endorsement letters and the well-being text messages reported feeling less impacted by COVID compared to treatment group 1 and the control. And I think we have time for potentially one more question as we're wrapping up. Otherwise, I can let you go and enjoy 3 minutes of your day. All right, well, that feels like a vote for 3 minutes back, which I'm very happy to give. So thank you all so much again for sharing your time with me. I think we'll be able to share these slides. This recording will be made public, and thank you to EdCan for letting us present this research. There's also a practitioner report that is up on their website that has a little bit more information on some of the practical ways that you might be able to use this research. So thank you again, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.